Once Again is funded in part by Union Bank and Trust in support of history programming on Nebraska Public Media. Family-owned for 60 years, UBT and its people are invested in the success of families, businesses, and communities. Member FDIC.
Natalie Sayans grew up in Scotts Bluff, the daughter of Mexican immigrants. She's a reporter with Telemundo Colorado now, and she helped me research this episode. It ended up being a revelation for her personally. She never fully understood how her family's history was interwoven with the history of the Panhandle's sugar industry.
To be completely honest, Bill, I had no idea. I just knew my dad worked in the factory. He worked, 12-hour shifts. He would come home smelling like sugar, I suppose it is. But I didn't realize the history behind it and the significance of it. And I also didn't understand that my dad was also a part of that history. This is my dad, Eloy.
Hello, Eloy.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, sir. It gave her a chance to do an interview with her dad, both as a journalist and a daughter, about working in the beet fields.
The work is hard, but it's healthy. I like being outdoors.
Now he works inside the sugar factory, filling bags with the sugar processed from the harvested beets.
It's something important to me. I can see my work there. When I see the product, I think, this went through my hands. It went through my machine. You just see the sugar and know someone else enjoys it.
It's also a source of pride to Eloy, having worked his way from field worker to a full-time factory worker who raised a daughter with a college degree. Eloy's story is a great example of the modern version of the cycles of immigrants and migrant workers that have driven the economy and the culture of Nebraska's Panhandle for 100 years. The ever-shifting American policies that impact who does the hardest and dirtiest work may be the most persistent political debate. And once again, it's affecting millions of lives. So let's learn how sugar provided the foundation for this state's Latina heritage. This is Once Again, a podcast from Nebraska Public Media about the stuff of history that's shaping the news today. I'm Bill Kelly, your host and researcher. Hop in. We're taking a drive along the back roads in the North Platte River Valley. It's where the shallow river leaves Wyoming and flows into Nebraska. Just to the south loom the weathered sandstone formations of the Scotts Bluff National Monument. It's hot and dry, so it might seem surprising that those crops on either side of the road are so lush and green. If you weren't from the area, you'd probably wonder, what are they growing over there? Is it spinach, potatoes? Well, you'd be wrong. But it's understandable. Most people have never laid eyes on a sugar beet. I'm guessing you're in that category. Yet, you are a customer. 60% of the sugar used in America comes from these beets, not from sugarcane. Those dark green leafy beets are why this is called the Sugar Valley. And as late as the 1990s, the field work was still being done by hand, hard labor. Stopping the car, you'd hear the crew speaking Spanish, brandishing sharp-pointed hoes to clear weeds or machetes to hack off the tops of the beets. Those are the beta boleros, the beet workers. Chances are their mothers and fathers did the same work after arriving from Mexico. Their grandfathers and great-uncles and great-grandmothers all provided the immigrant labor that pulled the beets out of the field, hauled them to the factory, turning the beets into sugar.
But if you didn't have a labor force, you didn't have your sugar beets.
Pascual Ramirez was one of those families with multiple generations tied to this land.
You took a culture that was of Latinos, Mexicans who came, who were used to working in the fields. These guys worked in the fields down there all the time. It's a different crop, but it's still a crop that takes intensive labor.
We're going to talk about that inseparable link between the sugar industry in Nebraska and the migrant workers, mostly of Mexican heritage, who provided the muscle and sweat. It happens in waves, the times the immigrants were pulled into the country and the times they were pushed away. Some have said there have been 4 cycles. First, the original migration starting in the early 1900s. Next, a policy to actively recruit workers after World War II. Then, undocumented workers starting in the 1960s. And the current situation that's honestly hard to put a label on yet. But first, let's talk to somebody whose family arrived with that first wave, not with a Mexican bloodline, but someone who lives surrounded by the beet fields.
Well, I'm Robert Bush. We're in Mitchell, Nebraska, on a farm that I've been on all my life and never left. I've been on the mile line now for 87 years, soon to be 88 if I make it, another month and a half.
For years, Bob Bush was the go-to guy when it came to beet farming in the valley.
Well, I started on my own in '59, and my dad and I was together until '74, until he dropped dead on me.
Bob got into beets because that's what his father did, which is what his parents did. Pete and Anna Bush started sometime around 1900 when a lot of Eastern Europeans fled in search of one thing.
Freedom. When they left Russia, things were not good. And how they wound up in Lincoln, I don't know.
What he does know is they were poor, and advertisements sought people willing to travel to work on farms farther west, so Pete and Anna went.
They would come 1st of May, mid-April, from Lincoln on what they called, in those days, the German train. There was a passenger train that run from Lincoln to Torrington.
They were migrant workers.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, they were migrants.
The Germans from Russia built a strong community in the Nebraska Panhandle heading into 1900. One of the few things they carried with them across the ocean were seeds, a crop they knew how to grow, sugar beets.
Why is this such a good area to grow beets?
Climate.
What?
Climate. Dry. Dry. You see, the sugar factory at Scottsbluff, that originally was in Grand Island. But because of the humidity in that region, they couldn't really grow sugar beets. So they tore that factory down and moved it to Scottsbluff.
Yeah, you heard right. Moved an entire factory 300 miles west. Scottsbluff was so eager to get a sugar factory, they raised $27,000 in startup capital and convinced Great Western Sugar to move the factory and make a $1 million investment in the Panhandle. Business leaders in Scottsbluff saw an opportunity. The plant opened in 1910. Politics favored sugar beets at the time. American policy attempted to shut out sugar cane imported from Cuba and Hawaii. Big tariffs on foreign-grown sugar drove up the price of imports. The result? An instant market for sugar beets grown and processed in the USA. Newspapers called sugar white gold. The North Platte River Valley region of Wyoming and western Nebraska became the second largest sugar beet region in America. Colorado was number one. Years earlier in Colorado, a very unique type of settler saw a future in sugar beets. The great-grandfather of Pascual Ramirez.
My great-grandfather actually homesteaded in Sterling, Colorado. And so they came from Mexico to Sterling, Colorado.
His family was a rarity. Having been a successful rancher in Mexico, his great-grandfather arrived in America with enough money to buy his own plot of land.
That he thought, I'm going to go start a new life. My grandmother, my dad's mother, had the ranch to run in Mexico. Great-grandpa ran the ranch in Colorado. And they moved livestock, Chisholm Trail. Yeah, my family's done a lot of great things.
At the same time, other migrants arriving from the West Coast found their way to Nebraska's Panhandle.
So we had colonies of Japanese that lived in this area. And then later they purchased ground that wasn't really sought after because it wasn't the best ground. But they knew certain practices that we didn't know, like the terracing and all that. They brought that to this valley.
In Scottsbluff County, in 10 years, the population jumped 147%, one of the highest percentage gains in America.
And this whole valley would not exist if you didn't have that rotation of the different cultures that were coming through.
By 1920, many of the Germans from Russia became landowners with the help of loans provided by the sugar companies. The immigrants Great Western recruited to work the fields 20 years earlier now owned most of the land dedicated to growing beets. As landowners, They didn't want to spend all their time doing what was called stoop labor, clearing weeds on their hands and knees. They recruited a second wave of immigrants to the region, cheap, hardworking labor.
There's a lot of things happening in Mexico that people can't make a living there, and there's labor needs of the United States.
Thomas Sanchez is an associate professor at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, in Latino and Latin American studies. He says looking south for workers only makes sense.
And then Mexico's so close, right? So there's easy control of that labor. You bring it in when you need it, and when you don't need it, you can send it back again. At least ideally, that's the way that people looked at it.
The sugar industry wanted to pull in new workers. In 1910, a political crisis, the Mexican Revolution, pushed people over the border looking for security and food.
It's a bit controversial, but there's a theory of push-pull, right, in terms of immigration. And the push in this case was the Mexican Revolution. It went from about 1910 to about 1917, depending on who you ask. So there was a lot of violence, crops weren't being grown, people didn't have money, and so they went north.
And what happened on the beet farms in Scottsbluff became the first in what would become a familiar cycle for the Latino immigrant workforce. Great Western realized in order to dominate the market for U.S.-produced sugar, they needed a system to recruit a steady supply of field labor. Ahead of the growing season, labor agents fanned out on either side of the Texas border.
So the lure was work, right? Just plain and simple was work.
And a paycheck.
And exactly for that reason, right? To support family.
Recruiters coaxed would-be beta boleros into trains heading to Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska. Free fare and meals brought plenty of takers, an estimated $2,000 a year just for Nebraska. Pat and Carlotta Dominguez were among those workers. Born in Mexico and brought to Scottsbluff, Nebraska as small children in the 1920s, they were interviewed for a documentary in the 1990s before they passed.
They used to have a train, maybe 15 or 20 families. Some had maybe 2 children, some maybe 10 children, some maybe 12 children.
It became common to recruit entire families. It was a more stable and reliable workforce than single men, and the kids were cheap labor. The beet farmers would show up at the depot to size up the arriving immigrants.
And this farmer said, well, this is my bunch, I want them. I got 25 acres and there's 3 of them. They can take care of my 25 acres.
They'd be taken by truck or wagon to a farm and dropped off at their new home, often a one-room shack.
We had to get our water from outside and the bathroom outside. And we had a cow, and we had pigs, and we had a chicken.
The old German people, it was kind of prejudice against the Mexican people because they don't like to live around here. When they got the opportunity to leave from this vicinity, they just moved out here.
Into the 1920s, around 60% of the farm workers were Mexican-American or citizens of Mexico. It was not always the better life they sought when boarding the train out of Mexico.
The beet industry enslaves about 30,000 field workers in the states of Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska.
That's the start of an admittedly sensational newspaper expose published in the Daily Worker in 1930 under the headline, "Starvation Wages for Mexican Beet Toilers."
These workers are brought into the beet area under false promises of good wages, good housing conditions, and a chance for education of their children.
Yes, this is a publication distributed by the pro-labor Communist Party of the era, but the historical research backs up the accusations of farmers unfairly withholding money earned in the fields, including Nebraska workers receiving only 30% of their wages. The newspaper featured a photo of a tiny tar paper-covered chicken coop provided to an immigrant family for their housing during the beet season. Housing became part of the strategy to attract migrant families to settle in the region. Great Western Sugar made real estate available to the beta boleros bordered by East Overland Avenue in Scottsbluff. Pascual Ramirez says this became the neighborhood known locally as the Barrio.
Why did East Overland become East Overland? Why was it there? Because of the factory.
Company housing.
Yep, that's what it was.
That hum, that's the sound of the factory. Different owners today, but part of the original plant still stands here in Scottsbluff.
And I don't know that a lot of people understand what it meant to be part of a company and company housing. You got your groceries there. You got everything there. But they took it out of your check. So did you get paid? Now let's go back to the slavery. Did you really get paid? Everything went back to the company.
The barrio is still here. It's a vital neighborhood anchored by the 100-year-old Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, where 3 times a week, Mass and hymns are heard in Spanish.
Por Jesucristo nuestro Señor. Amen.
More than a few congregation members grew up in the beet fields and still collect a paycheck at the sugar plant. The church and this neighborhood is here because of the prosperity of the sugar industry and its troubled relationship with its workers. But we've got more history to cover because after sugar's white gold days, things changed. World War I, the Great Depression, and with it comes a U.S. government policy that is mind-blowing when compared to what has unfolded in the 2020s. At one time, America all but begged the Mexican government to send its citizens over the border to work in this country.
Once Again is funded in part by the John C. and Catherine S. Angle Charitable Trust in support of history programming on Nebraska Public Media.
While visiting Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, I spent some time with the choir and music director, Rosie Cobos. That's her playing. Her music reflects her faith and often flows from her family's history as migrant workers.
They are the poorest among the working poor.
For years, she was a forceful advocate for farm workers. When considering the history of migrant labor, Rosie wants everyone to understand migrants can also be citizens.
Immediately, they assume that migrants are foreign-born, people that don't speak English, people that are undocumented, but that's not the case.
As the sugar industry grew over the last century, the field workers, the betaboleros, were a mixture of people, those crossing the border and Mexican Americans who found a home and citizenship here, as well as seasonal work.
The migrant simply means mobility, a mobile worker, the person who travels away from the place he or she calls home in order to perform agricultural work in one or more geographic locations, and then they return back to their home base, and they'll stay as long as there's work.
Rosie, a daughter of migrant workers, moved to Nebraska from California. Tonight, she shared a song with me, written for her father.
He was proud. He was very proud to do the type of work that he was doing. Bajo el sol ardiente lo verás.
The lyrics tell the story of a man, one who toils under the hot sun to put food on the tables of the world. The sweat of his brow makes him proud to be a peasant farmer, a campesino.
Bajo el sol ardiente lo verás.
The stories of the campesinos are the stories of the Nebraska sugar business. During the 1920s, the Hispanic population would ebb and flow across Nebraska. In Omaha, there were Mexicans working in packing houses, stockyards, and the railroad. Come spring, many would travel to the Panhandle in Wyoming to work in the beet fields, returning to Omaha or maybe Texas once the beets and potatoes were harvested.
There were people that came in the 20s that were recruited to work for the sugar industry. And so, they've contributed tremendously to this community, viable citizens.
As the 1930s arrived, American policy targeted Mexican workers when the economy turned sour. The Great Depression, America's most disastrous economic collapse. You know about the stock market crash and the Dust Bowl. American resentment and suspicion of Latinos became part of the American political rhetoric. The influential magazine, The Saturday Evening Post, ran articles with titles like "The Mexican Invasion" and "We Must Be on Our Guard." Workers once essential to farming became a threat. Tens of thousands of migrant farm workers relocated to Mexico. Some did so voluntarily. Thousands more were forced to leave without any formal deportation process, but by the local and federal government. Thomas Sanchez, the Latino Studies professor at UNO, said the Mexican government understood some of its citizens were ready to come home.
Mexico did agree to take some people back, and in the 30s specifically, because you think of the Depression was a worldwide depression, right? It wasn't just the U.S., but they thought that, oh, maybe these people know some stuff, that they're bringing back some cultural and social capital.
The official policy of the Mexican government for a time provided some returning immigrants with transportation back to their hometowns in Mexico if they could get to the border.
So now these other people are coming back and we don't care for them. They saw them, whether it was their choice or not, they saw them as kind of sellouts. You sold out the country, you went to the United States, now you want to come back?
But here's part of the story rarely discussed. You've seen all those images of farms in the Great Plains being devastated by the Dust Bowl. It was surprising for me to read that sugar beet farms from North Dakota through Nebraska hauled in a record harvest during the Depression in 1933. A year later, still profitable. An October 1933 headline in the Omaha World Herald proclaimed, "Harvest of sugar beets gives jobs to thousands." In November, when the sugar company handed out $3.5 million in payments to farmers, fights broke out in front of the Scottsbluff Bank when some field workers apparently felt they'd been shorted. So during the harvest that year, there were a lot of jobs in the fields and in the factory, but there is no mention of Mexican migrant workers in that coverage. Photos appear to show only Anglo faces. When the Great Depression ended almost immediately, farmers who relied on stoop labor rediscovered they needed Mexicans in the fields.
World War II happened.
This was when the father of Pascual Ramirez joined other members of his family working in the fields.
They were bringing men and families to work from Mexico because of all the loss of men in life in the United States, and they needed people to replace them. So that's when he came the first time.
Pascual's father first headed for the vegetable fields outside of San Francisco and then made his way to Nebraska later. The work was made possible because of an agreement between the American and Mexican governments, the Bracero Program. Sugar was a high priority crop during World War II. Migrant workers, mostly Mexican men, were brought north to work seasonally on short-term contracts. By opening the gates, Mexico provided its post-Depression workforce with jobs in America.
When you think about it, it's amazing that U.S. government policy for a while was to bring people across the border from Mexico.
Yes, yeah, because they were lacking the workforce. Absolutely.
My dad used them, I don't know how long.
We met Bob Bush earlier. His German farmer ancestors helped settle the Sugar Valley.
The sugar company sent a field man down and recruited. And they shipped up busload after busloads of Mexicans to thin beets and whole beets.
In the 1940s and 50s, over 250,000 farmhands were recruited from Mexico and shipped out for seasonal work across America. They picked cotton in Arkansas. They collected walnuts in New York. They tended rows of sugar beets in Nebraska. The stories of hundreds of these farm workers have been collected by the University of Texas El Paso for the Bracero History Archive.
Estamos en el Chamizal, en El Paso, Texas, entrevistando al señor Filomeno Burciaga.
I reviewed the English translations of hours of oral history interviews available online. Many worked in the sugar beet fields in Nebraska in the 1950s and 60s.
Buenos días, señor Filomeno.
Buenos días.
In his interview, Filomeno Burciaga talks about growing up on a farm in Chihuahua Province, planting corn and wheat. He was 20 when he signed up for the Bracero program, hoping to find work in the United States to earn money to help his parents. Filomeno says he was proud to be a Bracero. He explains the term means someone who works with their arms, with their hands. He didn't like how the word was twisted into slang meaning someone who takes work away from other people. He said, they hired us because they needed us. We didn't take their jobs in any way.
No trabajaban porque no eran flojos, no les gustaba el trabajo.
The whole Bracero system was a three-way partnership between the governments of the United States and Mexico, along with the recruiters working for the farmers. Those applying for work would line up at government centers and cities across Mexico. In 1950, Antonio Chavez Bentecourt enlisted at the office in Chihuahua.
Por ejemplo, en Chihuahua se abren
before he was sent to Nebraska.
En mayo al estado de Nebraska.
He remembers presenting a letter confirming he knew something about agriculture. An American recruiter asked to look at Antonio's hands.
Le revisaban las manos.
Sí. Sí, desde luego, pues ahora digamos ya...
¿Qué buscaban ellos en las manos?
Pues que fuera uno de veras.
What were they looking for? The interviewer asks. Antonio replies, the Americans checked to see if he had the rough, calloused hands of a farmer or the hands of an office worker.
No, pues tú eres de oficina, ¿verdad?
Así es.
Sí.
Filiberto Villaseñor Ocampo told the historian the American recruiters were better dressed, wearing jackets with good shoes and cowboy hats.
Con chamarras y todo lo mejor, que traen buenos zapatos y todo, traen los sombreros tejanos y bueno.
He remembers right away he got the idea of wanting to be like that person, wanting to see if he could bring back what those guys had. Everything I desired or envied, Filiberto says.
Ahora, como dijera yo, todo se desea o se envidia, vaya, ¿no? Sí.
The application process could be humiliating. At the hiring center in Juarez, Filiberto remembers being forced to strip naked. He describes how, assuming that the workers had lice, they fumigated us like animals, spreading a strong-smelling powder on his body.
Fumigaban como animales por piojo, yo creo.
The oral history interviewer asked Filiberto what the recruiters told him about the work. They told us it was not very hard, but certain jobs were extremely hard in the fields. These interviews go on to paint a vivid picture of what life was like in Nebraska for these braceros. Filomeno Burciaga, who we met earlier, found himself along with 6 other men from Chihuahua working for a beet farmer outside of Scotts Bluff for a few weeks. The braceros began weeding at 5 in the morning. Paid by the acre, it worked out to less than $1 an hour. At the end of the day, the grower would drive them back to their small bunkhouse. Each man would buy their own food and cook. The farmer would drive them to pick out groceries. It was the only time most of them went into town. In his interview, Antonio Chavez Bentecourt remembered on Saturday nights many of the farm hands liked to drink and play cards.
Pues que muchos les gustaba tomar y echar baraja.
He says those who did not play were kept up all night, and the boss would tell them to stop. Hey, no, that's not allowed here.
Marca el alto, ya no, pues aquí no se permite eso.
They paid us with little envelopes in cash.
Unos sobrecitos ahí en efectivo.
Inside, there would be a slip of paper with how much they took away from us for our insurance or medical expenses. If you earned, say, $35 or $40, they'd take $8 or $9 from you. Did they always take money away from you? The interviewer asks. Sí, yes. In these oral history interviews, many speak of broken promises from farms all over America. Decrepit housing, exposure to dangerous chemicals and bad water, paychecks withheld after hard work. There were supposed to be government protections in place, but there were few opportunities for the betaboleros to complain.
En el betabel, desrijando betabel. Era puro betabel.
¿Y en Nebraska?
También betabel.
Rodolfo Aranda Morales worked the beet fields in Nebraska and Wyoming as a bracero in 1953. In his oral history interview, he calls the program magnificent.
Era una cosa magnífica eso porque
Rodolfo talks about how people could find work, in his words, rightfully, legally. With the other way, he explains, everything is illegal and they're in danger of being caught and punished. So many sad things happening now. It's really ugly, he says. Rodolfo says workers struggled, even suffered. Was it worth it? The interviewer asks.
¿Valió la pena?
Yes, says Rodolfo. I was very happy working here. I was very happy the whole time I was employed because, above all, it was legal. I wasn't hiding anything. All of the men we just heard from returned to Mexico or Texas. But there was a shift underway as more and more Mexican and Latino families decided to stay. The Bracero program ended in 1964. Labor unions did not like it because they felt the government policy sanctioned cheaper labor provided by non-citizens. Civil rights advocates protested mistreatment of migrant workers. Coming up, we'll take a look at how the workforce changed and the long-gone notion that sugar was white gold.
You know, the sugar beet industry, I'm surprised it's still here. They're fighting tooth and nail to keep it going.
Pascual Ramirez says it's a long way from the days when his family came to the United States.
Their Mexican community involvement, yes, as they still work the factory.
Okay.
But they are not transient. They don't move. They're here and they work.
And as far as field work?
Gone. Those days are gone.
Once Again is funded in part by Union Bank and Trust in support of history programming on Nebraska Public Media. Family-owned for 60 years, UBT and its people are invested in the success of families, businesses, and communities. Member FDIC.
There's apparently an adage among those who rely on migrant labor. It goes like this: there is nothing more permanent than temporary workers. After the Braceros program ended in the 60s, the beets still needed weeding and thinning and harvesting. The Beta Boleros continued to work through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. A mixture of documented and undocumented seasonal workers following paychecks. And there was another group, one that didn't want to travel gig to gig. Over the years, they relocated from the Texas border or from Mexico, but decided to stay in Nebraska, raise their families. In growing numbers, these families became the legacy of the early migrants.
Okay, my name's Dora Maria Olivares, and I was born here in Scottsbluff County. My parents raised their children here. They were originally from around Crystal City, Texas, and settled here probably in the late 50s.
Her mother Olga came north. For her family, she wanted roots in the community. That meant keeping her kids in school.
That was her big deal, was she wanted us to have a high school education, something that she and most of her siblings never had.
They lived in Lyman, Nebraska, right on the Wyoming border, a small house with 11 kids to feed.
Starvation is a good motivator. You know, they had big families, lots of people to feed, and they had a lot of people to work.
Those times are pretty much gone. The need for migrant labor in the beet fields all but vanished. The beet farms themselves got smaller. The sugar industry didn't see it coming in the 1970s when it all looked so sweet and promising. The government ended controls on the production and prices of sugar.
So 1974, we grew beets for the first time without a program. And oh, wow, talk about gravy.
Bob Bush, who traces his roots to the Germans from Russia who settled the area, rode out the boom and bust years in the Sugar Valley.
Oh my God, guys made so much money. 75, sugar prices started to drop. And then you got that world market out there. And all of a sudden, everybody was growing sugar. By 1980 and 81, the sugar industry there was 17 sugar factories closed in the USA.
Now there's still plenty of sugar being produced. It's just being done with fewer workers. It's no longer the dominant employer in the Panhandle. These days, the local Walmart store hires more workers than the Great Western Sugar Cooperative. Out in the fields, the mechanics of agriculture slashed the need for migrant workers. Back in 1915, it took 120 hours of labor for a crew to produce an acre of beets. By the year 2000, efficient machines cut the field work to only 8 labor hours to tend an acre. 120 to just 8.
It has been interesting to watch how labor has changed over the years.
In the years after the Bracero program vanished, Bob Bush and his family found it harder to negotiate old-fashioned handshake agreements with seasonal workers.
I've had people come off the sidewalk, off of the road, come in and want to know if you had any work. You know, that was yesterday. Today, no, you don't ever have that. Migrants, we used to have pickup after pickup pulling the yard. Hey, we're looking for work. We don't have that at all today.
Valeria Rodriguez also sees the change.
I remember growing up in Mitchell, and there was this little, we would call it a campito. There's 9 apartments there. And every summer, that complex would get full of 9 different families. Now you don't see that. You don't see those migrant apartments getting filled up with migrant workers.
Val works with a new generation of immigrants every day as the executive director of a nonprofit agency. Today, sugar may not dominate the Latino community, but the influence of what those field workers brought to the Panhandle is undeniable.
Oh, it's been extremely important. I mean, the Latino community make up over 25% of Scottsbluff County.
In 1986, the Immigration Reform Act allowed a lot of migrant farm workers to become residents in the United States. In Nebraska, the number of Hispanic and Latino residents doubled by 1990.
We've started as farm workers. You know, I started as a farmer. That's where I started, you know, and now I'm an executive director to a nonprofit. My brothers are now the owners of the meat processing that my dad started at in 2000. You know, you start to see individuals opening up their own businesses and creating their own, you know, American dream.
They listened carefully during the State of the Union address in 2025 when President Trump spoke of the immigration policy changes to come.
For decades, open borders have allowed drugs and gangs to pour into our most vulnerable communities. They've allowed millions of low-wage workers to compete for jobs and wages against the poorest Americans.
In a matter of weeks around the country, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, began rounding up those accused of being in the country illegally.
We are at 32nd and L Streets in Omaha, where there is about 200 people gathered to protest after an immigration raid at a meatpacking plant in Omaha today.
Molly Ashford reported for Nebraska Public Media when the ICE raids unfolded in Omaha. No mass arrests in the Panhandle as we were preparing this episode, but the headlines nationally triggered memories for Pascual Ramirez of the time his family spent in the fields decades ago.
When my mom was working in the beet fields, it used to be like that. So what we call ICE today, they called it La Migración, immigration, would go to the beet fields. And they would take people. But they sent you back home. They're not doing that here, okay? You don't necessarily get to go home. You go to some prison somewhere.
Does this cycle, this past 6 months, does this feel different?
Oh, yeah.
How so?
I never carried my birth certificate with me.
You do now?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so do my boys.
To be clear, Pascual is a lifelong U.S. citizen. He's still worried. Current policy challenges what had been the foundations of immigration law: birthright citizenship, a green card protecting the opportunity to live and work in America.
I was fearful, to be honest, that, you know, my naturalized citizenship was going to get removed.
For those with a sense of history, like Val Rodriguez, these steps seem different, even from the mass repatriations to Mexico during the Great Depression.
We were getting walk-ins, phone calls, text messages of families just being afraid of sending their children to school.
Through her nonprofit, Empowering Families, Val is certified to advise people on what to do if approached by law enforcement asking questions about citizenship.
We talk to individuals about their constitutional rights once they've been arrested and detained, that they have the right to remain silent, they have a right to their phone call.
Does it just feel different for you right now in providing these kind of services?
There's a lot that it feels as if like when I could hear their worry and their fear in their voice, and I've had individuals just break down crying.
Val takes comfort in two things. First, American law. She's able to provide advice that feels tangible to those she's counseling.
We see a shift in mood of like, okay, I have control over this. I can't just be removed immediately. There are processes and so forth. And so you can see a sense of power being gained with those families.
The second comfort, faith. On the day we attended Mass at Our Lady of Guadalupe, the musicians were rehearsing one of the hymns, Éxodo y Liberación, Exodus and Liberation. The story of God delivering the Israelites from slavery, a commitment to the poor and oppressed. It's been a powerful theme in Latin American Catholicism.
It's big within the Latino and Mexican-American community here in Scottsbluff. And so we always tell ourselves, we just gotta have faith in the Lord and we're gonna be okay and so forth. And so it's like, okay, that's the reminder. So we just need to trust the Lord and we'll be okay.
Have a nice day. Tengan a feliz día.
So on a warm spring morning, among those leaving Sunday Mass, were people who had just moved to Scottsbluff months earlier, worshiping along with the grandchildren of those who had arrived to work in the fields decades earlier. Natalie Science was there also. We met her at the beginning of the episode, along with her dad Eloy, in the church basement.
It's interesting. I never would have thought I would be here to say this. I would never, ever imagine coming to the United States before.
At 12 years old, Eloy was already working on a farm in Mexico. That boy noticed when neighbors returned home with paychecks from America.
It was good money for a day's work, but I never thought I was going to go there.
In the 1980s, Eloy crossed the border without proper documents. He then followed the rules, earning his right to become an American citizen. Natalie asked why he and their mom never really talked with their kids about working in the beet fields.
We didn't think it was important until now.
Dora Olivares understands there is a reluctant pride that comes from doing the hardest work.
Well, I know better than most that we stand on their shoulders. So you have to always look back at your past, at the history, because that's what makes people what they are.
And so that family that got on the train crossing the border in 1910 leads to you right now.
Or leads to a doctorate and his 7 kids all being college graduates from a man who had to change his name to come here. Had nothing. So I think that we were silent contributors to our economy, and it wasn't recognized. And I don't think the people were the kind to really, they were humble. So they didn't toot their own horn about, oh, look at us. They just bent their heads and did the work.
You have been listening to Once Again, our exploration of history that's shaping the news today. It's a copyrighted production of Nebraska Public Media. If you like what you heard, leave a review where you found us. Once Again is produced and researched and hosted by Bill Kelly. That's me. Audio production is the work of co-producer Emily Kreutz. Field audio by Arthur Jones. Studio audio by Jeff Smith and David Hughes. Translation support from Cassidy Arena. Audio from the Nebraska Public Media Library was located by our archivist, Alexis Scargill. I especially appreciate the research and field production help provided by Natalie Science in Scottsbluff. Original music courtesy Rosie Kobos. Editorial review provided by Jay Omar, Matt Olberding, and Nancy Finken. And thank you to the voice actors you heard, Carlos Ruiz and Justin Cheney. Special thanks to the Legacy of the Plains Museum in Gering, Nebraska, and Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, Scottsbluff, Nebraska. The fascinating oral history interviews we relied on are the product of the Bracero History Archive, maintained by the Institute of Oral History at the University of Texas at El Paso. Visit our webpage to find more information about the topic, and you can hear the rest of the episodes from our first season. That's at nebraskapublicmedia.org/onceagain. And while you're at the website, you can drop us an email telling us what you thought of this episode or the entire series. Thanks for listening to Once Again.
Once Again is funded in part by the John C. and Catherine S. Angle Charitable Trust in support of history programming on Nebraska Public Media.